Hey guys. Tonight, we begin with a queen remembered for her beauty, her power, and some habits you probably wouldn't want to share a bathroom with. It's ancient Egypt, the world of Cleopatra, where luxury met tradition, and personal hygiene was sometimes more questionable than glamorous. The world is golden, exotic, and a little smellier than you've been led to believe. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just stepped into Cleopatra's world, where beauty and hygiene weren't always the same thing. You arrive in Alexandria at dusk. The sun, swollen and lazy, is sinking over the glittering Mediterranean, painting the waters bronze and scarlet. There is the faint sound of waves slapping against the docks, the cries of gulls circling overhead, and the smell of fish tar, sweat, and something sharp and sour that might once have been wine. Your sandals scuff against the worn stone streets, and already you realize that the stories of ancient splendor forgot to mention something important: people stink. Not just a little bit. The air clings to you, sticky with salt and bodies and decay, as though Alexandria itself is sweating under the weight of its own glory. Somewhere beyond the chaos of the port, Cleopatra sits in her palace, draped in silks, surrounded by clouds of perfume, and attendants ready to fan her. The poets will tell you she smelled of roses, cinnamon, and honey, the truth. If you stripped away the oils, the powders, the thick layer of imported frankincense, she probably smelled like everyone else in this humid city, sour, musky human. The perfumes weren't just a luxury, they were a weapon, a sweet-smelling disguise to mask the reality that soap, as you know it, hadn't been invented yet. Imagine walking into a crowded subway car in midsummer. Multiply the sweat by 100, add rotting fish, and now sprinkle rose oil over it. That's your welcome to Cleopatra's world. But don't wrinkle your nose too fast. Everyone here is used to it. Smell wasn't just part of the air, it was part of life, woven into the very identity of the city. Alexandria was a port where ships arrived daily with spices, oils, animals, and people. The streets reeked of camel dung, and the fish market spilled guts into the gutters. The palace might have been grander, yes, with polished marble and fountains trickling in the courtyards. But the water itself carried a tang of algae and mud, and the fountains weren't exactly chlorinated. You could imagine Cleopatra reclining in her gilded chair, her attendants dabbing her wrists with musk and almond oil, while somewhere not far away, a servant dumped a pot of chamber waste into the street. Royalty, after all, could not escape the stink of empire. Now, you might be picturing Cleopatra the way Hollywood gave her to us. Elizabeth Taylor in eyeliner sharp enough to cut glass, hair in perfect coils, lips forever glossed. But step closer. No, closer. The paint on her face wasn't Chanel or Revlon. It was powdered lead. Toxic, heavy, deadly lead. Cleopatra's signature look was basically a chemistry experiment on her skin. She applied kohl around her eyes not just for beauty, but also because it supposedly warded off infections in the harsh desert sun. Romantic, isn't it? A little eyeliner, a little deadly metal slowly poisoning your bloodstream. To put this in perspective, it's like us slathering ourselves in radioactive glitter today, because someone swore it kept away Wi-Fi headaches. Fashion, in every era, has had its questionable choices. Cleopatra just happened to pick one that killed people slowly while making them look irresistible. As you walk with me through these streets, you notice the women, noble and common alike, pulling scented cloths across their faces. The perfumes are thick, heady, like someone spilled an entire bottle of cologne in a gym locker room. Cleopatra adored perfumes. She owned warehouses full of them. Her lovers, they said, could smell her before they saw her. Impressive. Yes. Hygienic? Not really. Perfume wasn't there to make you smell lovely. It was there to make you smell less like sweat, rotting teeth, and sour milk. Imagine trying to cover up 3 days without showering using only Axe body spray. That was perfume in ancient Egypt. And then, of course, there were the baths. Cleopatra is often depicted as bathing in milk. Luxurious, creamy, decadent. A queen soaking herself in the nectar of cows. Except here's what the papyrus scrolls don't tell you: milk spoils quickly. Leave it out in the Egyptian heat, and within hours it turns sour, clumpy, and smells like a dumpster behind a cheese shop. So when Cleopatra lowered herself into her famous baths, she wasn't exactly luxuriating in silk and honey. She was sitting in a tepid tub of spoiled milk, clinging to the belief that it would soften her skin. Imagine drawing yourself a bubble bath today, pouring in gallons of expired yogurt, and lying back with a sigh. Relaxing, right? But she wasn't alone in these rituals. Her attendants were there, fanning her, massaging oils into her skin, cleaning her hair with concoctions made of ground plants and animal fat. Think of it like a spa day where the products are all organic but also terrifying. Your conditioner? A mix of castor oil and crushed herbs. Your face mask? Crocodile dung mixed with honey. Yes, crocodile dung. Somewhere a spa in Los Angeles is already selling this as a $500 treatment. You edge closer to the palace gates, and the guards glare at you. Their armor glints in the fading light, but even from here, you can smell the leather straps damp with sweat. Hygiene was never a soldier's strength. You'd think Cleopatra's palace would be a sanctuary from this. But the truth is, the stench followed everyone inside. Courtiers wore perfume so thick it clung to their robes, but beneath it lingered the sour tang of unwashed bodies. Slaves scurried with jugs of water for washing. But washing usually meant splashing yourself with a little water and rubbing with oil, then scraping it off with a metal blade. Imagine showering today by just rubbing olive oil on your skin and scraping it with a spatula. Refreshing, isn't it? Yet Cleopatra made all of this look divine. That was her power. She could walk into a room drenched in musk, skin tingling from spoiled milk, eyes rimmed in poisonous lead, and men would fall to their knees. Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, they weren't seduced by cleanliness. They were seduced by the illusion. Cleopatra knew that beauty wasn't about reality. It was about theater. And if that theater smelled faintly of dung and vinegar, so be it. As the evening deepens, the palace lights flicker, and the city hums with life. Somewhere, musicians are plucking lutes, children are chasing each other through the alleys, and a fishmonger dumps another pile of guts into the gutter. The air is thick, sweet, rotten, and alive. You're beginning to realize that Cleopatra's world wasn't polished marble and golden crowns. It was sweat, stink, and survival, covered up with as much perfume and poison as she could afford. And if you think spoiled milk baths and dung facials were the worst of her routines, wait until you discover what she did to her teeth. You take a cautious step forward, into the belly of the palace itself, and suddenly the air shifts. It's cooler here, shaded by high walls and draped in linen, but the relief doesn't last. The smell changes from open, airfish and dung to something heavier. More cloying, perfumes, oils, and the faint soreness of human bodies pressed too close together. Courtiers whisper. Slaves hurry past you carrying trays of fruit and wine, and there in the distance, you can almost sense her. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, last of the Ptolemies, master of seduction. They say her beauty was irresistible, but beauty, as you're quickly learning, was a performance. Stand close enough to Cleopatra, and you would see not flawless skin, but skin carefully painted, powdered, and oiled into submission. The famous glow she carried was as much animal fat and ground minerals as it was natural radiance. Every inch of her was curated, and yet beneath it, she was still a woman in a hot, humid city, with sweat dampening her silks and hair that needed to be calmed of lice. Even queens, after all, were not spared from bugs. Yes, lice, those tiny freeloaders of history. They thrived in ancient hair, weaving themselves into wigs and combs. Cleopatra's elaborate hairstyles, immortalized in marble, were often wigs made from human hair. They were works of art, yes, but also potential breeding grounds for little crawlers. Imagine slipping into your finest ball gown only to realize your crown is itching not from jewels, but from an army of unwelcome tenants. Modern fashion problems are nothing compared to this. At least today, if your extensions start itching, you can discreetly call your stylist, instead of ordering a slave to boil your wig in vinegar. You move closer to the throne room, and the sounds grow louder. Music, laughter, the clink of cups. Here she is, reclining among cushions, eyes lined in dark kohl, lips painted red with crushed carmine beetles. Yes, beetles. Cleopatra's lipstick was a paste of insect shells, mixed with oil and sometimes sprinkled with glittering minerals. The effect was dazzling, the reality less so. Imagine kissing someone who's wearing bug paste and telling yourself, "This is the pinnacle of romance." Mark Antony might not have cared, but you can bet he noticed the crunch. And then there were the teeth. This is where things get grim. Ancient Egyptian dental hygiene was inventive. Cleopatra, like her people, brushed her teeth with powders made from ground pumice ash and sometimes salt. Effective at scraping away grime, yes, but also excellent at grinding down enamel. Over time, teeth cracked, gums bled, and mouth stank. Add to this a diet heavy in bread made with stone, ground flour. Tiny shards of grit that wore teeth like sandpaper. And suddenly that radiant smile doesn't seem quite so fresh. Cleopatra may have charmed Caesar with her wit and Antony with her allure, but behind closed doors, it's likely her breath was more memorable than her jokes. Of course, she had remedies. Egyptians believed rinsing the mouth with a mixture of natron, a salty mineral, and vinegar could keep it fresh. The result, a burning, sour swish that probably left her tasting like a pickle jar. Imagine going on a first date today, leaning in close, and smelling not mint or coffee, but vinegar and blood. Love at first sight might still happen, but the kiss, questionable. The palace itself wasn't much better. Yes, the floors gleamed with marble, and yes, gold glinted from every surface, but the plumbing was rudimentary. Chamber pots overflowed. Servants rushed to empty them, often by tossing the contents into cesspits or canals, which weren't exactly far from where the city drew its drinking water. Mosquitoes bred in stagnant pools, flies swarmed around kitchens, and the sweet reek of rot hovered in the air. Cleopatra's chambers were cleaned constantly, but even constant cleaning in antiquity meant sweeping, burning incense, and throwing more perfumes around. You can almost picture her rolling her eyes as yet another servant spritzed frankincense while a rat scuttled across the corner of the room. Perfume, in fact, was everywhere. Cleopatra was obsessed with it. She wasn't content just to wear it. She weaponized it. Historians tell us that when she sailed to meet Mark Antony, the sails of her ship were soaked in perfume, so the scent would reach the shore before she did. A brilliant seduction strategy, yes. But imagine being one of the sailors stuck on that boat, surrounded by the cloying sweetness of myrrh and cinnamon for weeks on end. It's one thing to dab perfume on your wrists. It's another to marinate your entire workplace in it. But here's the thing in her world, stink was political. Perfume wasn't just luxury, it was status. To smell strongly of flowers or spice meant you had wealth, servants, and access. To smell of sweat meant you were poor, working, ordinary. Cleopatra's cloud of fragrance wasn't just to cover filth, it was to declare power. Think of it like walking into a modern boardroom, dripping in designer cologne, so strong everyone coughs. But no one dares complain, because you're the boss. You're beginning to see that Cleopatra's hygiene wasn't disgusting because she ignored it. It was disgusting because the tools of her time turned beauty into something we'd call filth today. Imagine milk curdling on your skin, beetle shells in your lipstick, dung in your face mask, vinegar burning your gums, and oils scraping sweat off your body instead of soap. Yet she owned it, twisted it into a lure, and left men believing she was a goddess. But not everything could be hidden. As you wander into the kitchens, the air is thick with roasting meat, garlic, and something less pleasant, the smell of unwashed hands preparing food. Servants scurry barefoot, flies buzzing around platters. You can't help but notice the irony. Cleopatra feasts on delicacies while her stomach churns with bacteria invisible to the naked eye. Food poisoning, stomach cramps, parasites. These were as much a part of royal dining as peacocks and figs. Imagine attending a Michelin-starred dinner where every dish has a 50-50 chance of sending you to the bathroom for 2 days. That was dinner with Cleopatra. And yet, despite all of this, she thrived. She leaned into the filth, molded it into majesty. She knew that in a world without modern hygiene, everyone stank, everyone suffered, everyone carried lice and bad teeth, but not everyone could transform it into spectacle. That was her genius. You glance back toward her, reclining in her silks, eyes watching you like a cat. Around her neck hangs a necklace heavy with gold, and behind her, incense burns in braziers, filling the air with a smoky sweetness that clings to your lungs. The room is warm, heavy, and strangely suffocating. You shift uncomfortably, wondering how long anyone could actually sit in this haze without gasping for fresh air. Cleopatra doesn't seem to mind. She has trained herself to thrive in the stink of empire, while everyone else simply endures it. And here's the uncomfortable truth: if you, fresh from the 21st century, suddenly found yourself beside her, she would probably wrinkle her nose at you. Not because you stink, though you'd certainly notice her, but because you don't. To her, your deodorized, showered, sanitized scent would smell alien, sterile, even unpleasant. In her world, a queen was supposed to reek of perfume and oils, of spice and smoke, of life lived in a cloud of overwhelming presence. To smell like nothing was to be no one. So when she leaned close to whisper in Antony's ear, he didn't flinch at the vinegar breath, the oils, or the faint soreness beneath the perfume. He leaned in further, convinced he was inhaling the very essence of divinity. You have to give her credit, that's talent. Now, as you step back, the night outside is thick with music, the city alive with revelry, and you realize something important. This isn't just about Cleopatra. This is about the human story of dirt, of how we've always wrestled with our bodies, our smells, our illusions of beauty. Cleopatra was simply the most brilliant actress in history's filthiest play. And if you think spoiled milk baths, beetle lipstick, and vinegar mouthwash were disturbing, wait until you discover what she put on her eyes. You lean closer now, your gaze drawn to the queen's eyes. They're the stuff of legend, painted wide and long with lines of kohl that sweep into a dramatic wing sharp enough to make even the most seasoned influencer jealous. The black rims turn her stare into something hypnotic, the way a cat's pupils seem to trap light and reflect it back at you. People say men drowned in those eyes before they even touched her lips. But what you can't help noticing, from your position as a time-traveling eavesdropper, is the faint shimmer of dust clinging to her lashes and the oily shine that spreads slightly with the heat of the room. That dark line isn't just makeup, it's chemistry. Cleopatra's kohl was made from galena, a form of lead sulfide. Yes, the same lead we now strip from paint, water pipes, and gasoline, because it slowly destroys your body from the inside. But in her world, this wasn't poison, it was medicine. Egyptians believed kohl protected the eyes from disease, dust, and the glare of the desert sun. And there's some truth to it. In small doses, the lead triggered the body's immune response, helping to fight off infections like conjunctivitis. Genius, in a way. Dangerous, certainly, but also practical. It's like wearing mascara today that doubles as an antibiotic, but also guarantees mild lead poisoning after a few years. Pick your poison, literally. Of course, there were side effects. Skin irritation, inflamed eyelids, headaches, perhaps even hallucinations if you got a little too liberal with the application. Imagine Cleopatra, late at night, eyeliner smudging under her eyes, her temples throbbing, but still commanding the room like a goddess. Beauty, after all, was worth suffering for. Haven't we all at some point chosen uncomfortable shoes, burning hair bleach, or the slow torture of shapewear in the name of looking fabulous? Cleopatra was simply playing the same game, with higher stakes. Her attendants prepared the kohl carefully, grinding galena into a fine powder, mixing it with oil or fat to make it glide smoothly. The brushes were often slender sticks of wood or ivory, rubbed along the edge of her eyelids with practiced precision. You imagine leaning in to see the process. The faint scrape of stone against stone, the fine black powder lifting like smoke, the nervous hands of a servant as they dab it carefully onto their queen's eyes. One slip, one careless poke, and it could mean a beating, or worse. The stakes of Cleopatra's eyeliner were far higher than your average YouTube tutorial. The effect, though, was undeniable. Her eyes gleamed, framed in black, wide and watchful. They weren't just pretty, they were political. To the Egyptians, eyes rimmed in kohl weren't vanity, they were sacred, connected to the god Horus and his divine protection. Cleopatra's face wasn't just makeup, it was a spell. Every glance she gave her courtiers said, "I am untouchable, divine, eternal." Which makes sense, because when you live in a palace that sometimes smells like a damp stable, a little divine branding goes a long way. And yet, there was another layer to this ritual. Underneath the kohl, Cleopatra's skin bore the faint traces of irritation, redness, dryness, maybe even rashes from years of toxic powders. You wouldn't notice it from a distance, Not through the haze of perfume and incense, but up close. Up close, Cleopatra's beauty wasn't flawless. It was built, maintained, and patched together daily, like a set designed for a play. The tragedy is that no one ever tells us how exhausting it must have been to wake each morning and rebuild herself, layer by layer, in a ritual of lead and oil, perfume and powder, while knowing every bit of it was slowly wearing her body down. Now, picture the aftermath. She removes the kohl at night, if she removed it at all, by wiping it with cloth, or rubbing more oil into her eyes to loosen it. There's no gentle cotton pads here, no micellar water, just rough fabric and animal fat. Some of it stayed, sinking into her skin, staining the creases of her eyelids. The next morning, she layered more on top. Day after day, week after week, the lines darkened, the lead sank deeper, and her gaze became less about natural beauty and more about theatre. It's funny, in a twisted way, that we still do the same. Our shelves groan under miracle products that promise health and radiance, while sneaking in chemicals we can barely pronounce. Cleopatra's eyeliner, our anti-aging cream, two sides of the same coin. The only difference is that she believed hers connected her to gods, while we're told ours makes us timeless. Perhaps the gods of marketing are just better dressed. And here's where it gets even stranger. Cleopatra didn't stop at black. Sometimes she used malachite, a shimmering green copper ore, for her eyeshadow. Lovely, dazzling, jewel-toned. Also poisonous. Copper salts irritated the skin, sometimes causing swelling or discoloration. But the effect was mesmerizing under the torchlight. Her eyes, green and black, flashing like gems in the dim hall, would have seemed otherworldly. And that's what mattered. To Cleopatra, every smudge of mineral dust wasn't vanity, it was strategy. She didn't need to be clean. She needed to be unforgettable. The irony is that while her lovers wrote poems about her beauty, they probably also rubbed their own irritated eyes after kissing her cheeks, whispering sweet nothings while trying not to sneeze from the clouds of powder clinging to her skin. Imagine Mark Antony, big and brutish, leaving the palace after a night of passion with red, rimmed eyes and a faint rash, muttering to his soldiers that it was worth it. That's the cost of empire, gentlemen. And you can't help but think, as you watch her tilt her face to the firelight, that this ritual wasn't just disgusting. It was exhausting. To hold a kingdom together, Cleopatra had to hold her own body together with layers of toxins and disguises. To her, the smell of vinegar, the itch of lice, the sting of lead, it wasn't filth. It was armor. If you think painting your eyes with poison was unsettling, wait until you discover what she put on the rest of her face. You lean against a marble column, eyes fixed on the queen as her attendants flutter about her like anxious moths. One brushes scented oil across her wrists, another mixes a pale powder in a shallow bowl. This powder, when dabbed across her cheeks, gives her skin the smooth, matte finish of alabaster. From a distance, she looks flawless, divine, radiant, untouchable. Up close, you can smell the faint metallic tang of the concoction, see the dust cling unevenly where sweat gathers along her jawline. That powder, beloved of Cleopatra, was ceruse white lead carbonate. The same poisonous substance European ladies would slather on their faces a millennium later, chasing the ghostly pallor of aristocracy. Cleopatra's world valued fairness of skin as a sign of status too. After all, only the wealthy could afford to stay indoors, while servants toiled under the sun. But ceruse was no gentle veil. It seeped into pores, inflamed the skin, and over time caused sores, discoloration, and even neurological damage. The glowing complexion it promised came at the cost of a slow, invisible decay beneath the surface. You can almost imagine the quiet irony. Cleopatra, the most powerful woman of her age, layering onto her face a powder that was, in essence, eating her alive. And yet, what choice did she have? Appearances were everything. Rulers couldn't afford to look merely human. She had to look like Isis reborn, a goddess among mortals. If that meant dusting herself with death every morning, then so be it. It's not so different from us, really. Swap out lead for retinol that peels your skin raw, or Botox that numbs your face into a mask. Cleopatra's powder was our anti-aging serum, just with a slightly higher chance of organ failure. She was, in many ways, the original beauty influencer, only her sponsorship deals came from priests and poets rather than TikTok brands. Her attendants worked with trembling precision. They knew the balance between too much powder and too little. Too much, and the queen looked ghostly; sickly; too little, and the blemishes showed through. And blemishes were unacceptable. Cleopatra wasn't allowed to look like a woman with pores and imperfections. She was an ideal, carefully constructed, and any crack in that illusion could be political suicide. But the powder didn't sit alone. It needed color. Into bowls went mixtures of crushed ochre for blush, carmine beetles for lipstick, and sometimes henna for staining fingertips. The result was dazzling in the flickering light of torches. Her cheeks flushed, her lips crimson, her nails tinted. But each color came from something that lived, something crushed or boiled or ground. Beauty was extracted violently from the world around her. You can't help but think of a modern bathroom shelf, rows of sleek bottles, each filled with chemicals tested in labs. Cleopatra's lab was the desert, the river, the animal pens, and the mineral mines. A cosmetic bag filled with beetles, dung, and ground rock. Then comes the perfume, the Pisces de resistance. Earlier you smelled it in the streets, cloying and oppressive. Here, in her chamber, it is overwhelming. Vials of oil and resin are uncorked, their scents heavy with frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, cardamom, roses, and lotus. They are mixed into thick ointments, rubbed onto her skin until it glistens. The fragrance clings to everything. Her silks, her cushions, even the marble beneath her. The palace itself smells like Cleopatra. But perfume in this age was not the light spritz we know today. It was oil-based, sticky, and strong. Once applied, it did not fade in an hour. It lingered for days, seeping into pores and fabrics. Cleopatra didn't simply wear perfume. She wore an aura. Anyone who stepped into her presence breathed her before they saw her. The smell announced her, dominated her, consumed her. And let's be honest, it had to. Without it, the truth would have been too obvious. The sweat under her gown, the sour tang of curdled milk from her baths, the vinegar from her mouth rinses, all of it hidden under clouds of cinnamon and lotus. Perfume wasn't luxury, it was camouflage. If you've ever sprayed deodorant in the morning to hide the fact you skipped a shower, congratulations. You and Cleopatra have something in common. Yet, the oils themselves weren't always clean. Stored in clay jars under the relentless Egyptian sun, they could turn rancid quickly. Imagine smearing spoiled olive oil onto your skin and calling it moisturizer. The rich, earthy aroma of frankincense might have masked it, but the underlying funk was still there. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, was probably as greasy as a late-night pizza box. Her hair, too, required attention. Sometimes it was her own, sometimes wigs of imported locks, woven into intricate braids. They were oiled, perfumed, and styled with pins of gold. But the reality beneath the glamour was itchy, heavy, and hot. Sweat trickled under the wigs, the oils attracted dust, and the scalp beneath often went unwashed for days. Cleopatra's crowning glory was, in truth, a crown of inconvenience. And then there were the stranger treatments, whispered among her attendants. To maintain her skin, she sometimes used face masks of honey mixed with crocodile dung. Honey was antiseptic, soothing. Dung was well dung. But in the logic of the age, the two together promised vitality. Imagine sitting still while your servants slather your face with swamp filth, assuring you that the gods themselves recommended it. Self-care Sunday, but ancient edition. This is the paradox of Cleopatra, filth disguised as beauty, poison disguised as medicine, rot disguised as radiance. She was both the most beautiful woman of her world and one of its dirtiest secrets. The filth didn't matter. The illusion did. And perhaps that's why she remains unforgettable. Not because she was clean or perfect, but because she understood that nobody needed to see the cracks. Perfume over sweat, powder over sores, kohl over irritation, layer upon layer, until the woman disappeared and the goddess remained. You lean back, dizzy from the scents, blinking against the smoke of incense. Somewhere behind you, the city groans with its own smells, markets, animals, waste. And here in this chamber, Cleopatra glitters like a star, painted in toxins and illusions. She is both repulsive and magnetic, a reminder that power has always been built on performance. And if you thought her face was unsettling, wait until you see what she did to her body in the name of health. The marble floor beneath you is still cool, though the air has grown heavy with the fog of perfumes clinging to your lungs. And then, as if the queen has tired of her painted transformation, she rises from her stool with an unspoken command. The attendants scatter, leading you down another corridor, deeper into the palace, until the scents of resin and coal give way to something far stranger. The air is sour now, tangy and sweet at once, like milk left too long in the sun. And then you see it. A shallow pool, carved into stone, steaming faintly under the torchlight. A dozen clay jars stand nearby, their contents sloshing as servants pour them in, one by one. White liquid cascades into the bath, frothing at the edges. Donkey's milk. Not one or two jars, but hundreds. Cleopatra's famous ritual, the milk bath. You'd think it would smell fresh, like the sweetness of cream. Instead, it hits you with the sour sting of fermentation, the faint barnyard musk of animal fat. Imagine soaking in a tub of expired yogurt. The kind you forgot at the back of the fridge. This is not the luxury of a goddess. It's the funk of a dairy farm disguised as divinity. Yet the reasoning behind it was clear. The lactic acid in the milk softened the skin, smoothed wrinkles, and gave her a radiant glow. Or so they believed. Science would later confirm that lactic acid does exfoliate, but science would also tell you that Cleopatra was effectively bathing in spoiled milk most of the time. Egypt was hot, the milk spoiled quickly, and servants couldn't refrigerate it. So here she sat, Queen of the Nile, marinating in a tub of sour curds, her pores opening to soak it all in. If you've ever left a glass of milk out overnight, and then made the mistake of sniffing it the next morning, you know what Cleopatra's chamber smelled like. Only now imagine it multiplied by gallons, warmed, and splashed around as attendants fanned their mistress with ostrich plumes. Luxury, in the ancient sense, was not always fragrant. Still, there was ritual in it. The milk bath was not just skin care, it was symbolism. Milk meant fertility, nourishment, life itself. In bathing this way, Cleopatra was embodying more than beauty. She was embodying the mother goddess Isis, sustainer of the people. The bath was theatre, a performance staged daily in the intimacy of her chambers, whispered about in the streets as legend. She didn't just keep her skin soft, she kept her myth alive. Yet myths do not prevent infections. The milk carried bacteria. Skin infections were common, rashes frequent. And though honey was sometimes mixed into the bath to counteract this, the reality is that Cleopatra probably emerged from her ritual both fragrant and itchy, glowing with both radiance and irritation. But irritation was not weakness if it could be covered in powder and perfume. Power, after all, is always a little itchy. As you watch her recline into the milk, eyes half closed, you can't help but think of modern spas, mud baths, seaweed wraps, hot stone massages. We too soak ourselves in things that, out of context, are absurd. Cleopatra's bath was no different. Just less Instagrammable. When she finally steps out, attendants rush forward with cloths, patting her dry, scraping the clinging film from her skin. More oils are rubbed in immediately, almond, olive, sesame, sometimes mixed with crushed rose petals or herbs. The queen glistens again, radiant in torchlight, though you know the secret. Under the sheen is the faint sourness of donkey milk, that even the richest frankincense cannot completely hide. But milk was only the beginning. For health, Cleopatra embraced other treatments, many of which are far less glamorous. Enemas, for example, were a favored practice in Egypt. Cleanliness of the bowels was equated with purity of the body, and physicians recommended purging as a cure for nearly everything. Cleopatra herself is said to have followed these regimens, though her royal enemas were prepared with wine, honey, and sometimes herbal infusions. Imagine lying in silken sheets while a servant administers what is essentially a honey and wine flush, all in the name of vitality. The court physicians, inheritors of both Egyptian and Greek knowledge, swore by these treatments. They believed bad humors collected in the body and had to be expelled, whether through vomiting, bleeding, or purging. Cleopatra's body, therefore, was a battlefield between indulgence and evacuation. A feast of figs and dates one night, followed by a forced purge the next. The rhythm of her health was not balance, but constant correction. And speaking of feasts, the queen's diet was itself a blend of decadence and necessity. Egypt's wealth of the Nile meant bread, beer, fish, and dates for the common people. For Cleopatra, the tables groaned with roasted meats, honey cakes, figs, grapes, and imported delicacies from across the Mediterranean. Banquets were political theatre, but they were also breeding grounds for indigestion. Rich foods in excess, combined with wine that was often thick and sweet, left the stomach heavy. Cue the purges, cue the enemas, cue the physicians with their endless jars of remedies. One such remedy, whispered about by scribes, was a fertility potion said to aid conception. Cleopatra, though she bore children, lived in constant awareness that her lineage was political currency. And so she turned to bizarre treatments, mixtures of ground crocodile dung, inserted vaginally as a contraceptive, or honey, soaked sponges meant to both protect and encourage fertility depending on the recipe. Imagine, for a moment, the Queen of Egypt trusting her future to crocodile excrement and a few drops of honey. It is both absurd and utterly human, because when it comes to reproduction, people in every age have reached for whatever promise lay at hand. Of course, these concoctions were less than sterile. Infections, again, would have been common. But the body was always the site of risk in antiquity. To live was to gamble with rot, with fever, with parasites. Cleopatra's beauty may have dazzled, but beneath the gold and perfume, her body was likely no stranger to the discomforts of daily survival. And here lies the strangest contrast. She was a woman of immense power, commanding armies, seducing emperors, ruling nations. Yet she was also a woman who sat in baths of spoiled milk, submitted to enemas of wine, and trusted her fertility to crocodile dung. Her power was cosmic, her hygiene was catastrophic. You glance at the jars along the walls. Some contain herbs, anise, fennel, coriander, others hold resins and dried animal parts. The physicians had a cure for everything, and all of it smelled foul. Powdered liver of oxen, ashes of mice, ground beetles mixed with honey, even dried entrails of fish. Remedies were more ritual than relief, and Cleopatra, like all mortals, had no choice but to hope they worked. One jar in particular catches your eye: dried viper flesh, crushed into powder. It was said to restore vigor, to ward off fatigue, even to stir passion. Cleopatra's body, like her face, was a site of performance. To appear youthful, vital, fertile, that was power. And if that meant swallowing powdered snake or smearing dung upon her skin, then so be it. It is both grotesque and strangely familiar. Think of our shelves lined with supplements, detox teas, miracle vitamins whose benefits are dubious at best. Cleopatra's snake powder is our collagen gummy. Her milk bath is our chemical peel. Time changes the ingredients, but never the desperation to resist decay. You step back, almost tripping over a basin where servants are emptying remnants of the milk bath. The sour stench rises again, sharp in your throat. You realize then that the Queen's chambers are not sanctuaries of beauty, but laboratories of endurance. Every ritual is both cure and curse, every treatment both promise and poison. Cleopatra lives balanced on the edge of decay, her glory always one layer of perfume away from ruin. And if you think her private rituals were unsettling, wait until you step outside the palace and see how the city itself managed hygiene. You leave the palace behind, though not without a final breath of resin and myrrh clinging to your throat. The marble fades into packed earth as the city opens around you, and suddenly the world of Cleopatra, the perfumes, the milk baths, the guarded luxury, falls away into a far different aroma. Alexandria, jewel of the Mediterranean, stinks. The streets are wide, laid out in grids with clever precision, a gift of the Greeks who founded this city 2 centuries earlier. From above it is geometry. On the ground it is chaos. Dust blows through the avenues, mingled with the reek of fish, sweat and dung. Thousands of people press together. Sailors from Rhodes, traders from Phoenicia, priests in Lenin, beggars clutching at ankles. Humanity collides in every corner, and with it, the consequences of poor hygiene. You try to breathe shallowly, but it does not help. The harbor dominates the city, and its odor drifts inland with the sea breeze. The ships arrive daily, their hulls swollen with cargo, grain, papyrus, spices, ivory. They also bring bilge water, spoiled goods, and rats, always rats. The great wharves hum with their scratching, black tails slithering among piles of grain, gnawing at sacks until their bellies are fat. Men shout and curse, throwing rotten fish into the shallows where gulls fight and squawk. The water churns, oily, a mixture of salt sewage, and the endless waste of trade. Alexandria is prosperity wrapped in decay. You turn down one of the side streets, cobbled but uneven. Wastewater trickles along the edges, a dark rivulet carrying refuse from kitchens and workshops. In theory, the city has drains, stone channels meant to whisk away filth. But they clog easily, and no one wants to unclog them. So the water stagnates, forming puddles that breed clouds of mosquitoes. Children run barefoot through them, their laughter echoing, their legs splattered with muck. For them, this is life, normal and unremarkable. Only you recoil, knowing each splash carries invisible dangers. The markets are worse. Stalls pressed close together, wooden tables piled with meat, bread, fruit, and pottery. The smell of fresh figs mixes with that of raw goat organs laid open under the sun. Blood drips onto the ground, soaking into straw already blackened with flies. A butcher wipes his knife on his apron, which has not been washed in months, and smiles as if the act is normal. You watch a woman bargain for a fish that is already beginning to turn grey, its eyes clouded. She smells it, shrugs, and pays. Preservation here is salt or nothing. Rot is always only a few hours away. And yet, amid the stench, there is beauty. Pyramids of pomegranates glow ruby red. Garlands of herbs perfume the air with fleeting freshness. You see glass vessels shimmering in the sun, Alexandrian glass so prized it will travel to Rome and beyond. The chaos of smells is almost dizzying. Fragrant mint and putrid entrails, honey cakes and horse dung, incense smoke and human sweat. The city is a paradox. Filth and wonder layered like paint on a wall. But where does all this filth go? Nowhere mostly. Chamber pots are emptied directly into the streets. At night, slaves or children are sent to fling waste into the nearest ditch or gutter. Rain is rare, so the filth accumulates, baked by the sun until it hardens into a crust of stench. When the Nile floods, it washes through the lower quarters, mixing river silt with months of human and animal waste. The water that nourishes Egypt also poisons it. The public baths attempt to counter this. Modeled on the Greek style, they invite citizens to wash, to sweat, to scrape their bodies clean with bronze strigils. But water is drawn from cisterns not always clean, and the pools become petri dishes of shared skin and dirt. Still, people go. To be unwashed is to be barbaric, and Alexandria prides itself on being civilized. Civilized, here, means sweating with strangers in tepid water that has seen 1,000 bodies before yours. You drift toward the poorer quarters, where the air thickens. Houses are packed tightly, upper floors leaning precariously over alleys barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. Laundry dangles from ropes overhead, dripping onto the street below. In the shadows, refuse piles up broken pottery, spoiled bread, dead animals. Cats slink through, their bodies gaunt, their eyes gleaming. Egypt worshipped cats once. Here they are scavengers, keeping the rats at bay, though never enough. The smell of decay lingers in every doorway. Step inside one of these homes, and you find little relief. The floor is dirt, swept but never clean. Smoke from a cooking fire blackens the ceiling, stinging your eyes. A family sleeps on mats pressed together, their bodies sweating through the night. Lice crawl in hair, fleas in bedding. Water for washing is scarce. A jar in the corner is used for both rinsing hands and drinking. A child scratches at sores on her arms, smiling through the itch. Illness is not an interruption of life here, it is woven into it. In wealthier houses, conditions improve only slightly. Courtyards provide ventilation, mosaics brighten the walls, fountains trickle with water drawn from underground channels. But even here, waste disposal is crude. Latrines empty into cesspits that overflow if neglected. Servants are tasked with scooping the muck into jars and hauling it away, often to be dumped on the outskirts of the city. The stink follows them, clinging to their skin. Cleanliness, once again, is only an illusion. Yet Alexandria dazzles, despite the filth. The library rises above it all, a sanctuary of scrolls and scholars. Inside its cool halls, papyrus crackles faintly, ink perfumes the air, and the chaos outside seems far away. But even the scholars suffer. Scribes develop eye infections from soot lamps, coughs from the dust of old scrolls, cramped hands from endless writing. Knowledge itself is written in sweat and grime. The temples, too, gleam from a distance, columns painted bright, altars heavy with offerings. But approach them and the smell of sacrifice overwhelms. Bulls, goats, birds, all slaughtered, their blood draining onto stone, their entrails burned in offering. The smoke mixes with incense, sweet and acrid, curling into the sky. Devotion smells like ash and offal. And always, there is the harbor, the beating heart of Alexandria. The Pharos lighthouse towers above, its flame guiding ships by night, its stone glittering by day. Sailors stagger onto the docks, unwashed, vomiting from the journey, their bodies swarming with lice. Prostitutes call to them. perfumes unable to mask the odor of sweat and disease. Taverns spill over with drunkards, their vomit pooling in gutters, their laughter rising above the stink. This is the glory of Alexandria, mother of commerce, queen of the Mediterranean, reeking like a tavern floor. You begin to see the pattern. Cleopatra's perfumed chambers were not an escape from filth, but a mask against it. Her body rituals, bizarre and desperate, were simply her way of staying one step ahead of the decay that engulfed her city. The milk bath was not only vanity, it was armor against the stench of her own streets. The oils, the incense, the endless layers of paint, all shields against rot. Her beauty was less natural than defensive, a wall of fragrance against the assault of reality. And perhaps that is why she seduced emperors and generals so effectively. To men who came from Rome, where the stench was just as overwhelming, Cleopatra must have seemed almost divine, not because she was untouched by filth, but because she fought it with such ferocity. Her body was a declaration. I am cleaner than the world around me. I am more fragrant, more radiant, more alive. Even if the truth was sour milk and crocodile dung, the illusion held. And in antiquity, illusion was power. As the sun sets over Alexandria, the smells deepen. Fires light in every quarter, smoke curling through the streets, mingling with the day's refuse. The drains are clogged, the gutters full, the air heavy with rot. Yet music rises too, flutes, drums, voices chanting. Laughter echoes from taverns, prayers from temples, cries from markets still bustling. Life refuses to be crushed by stench. Alexandria stinks, but it sings. And you, wary from the odors, realize the most unsettling truth people did not notice. They were born into this world of sweat and waste, and to them, it was simply life. To you, it is filth, to them, it is home. The palace is quiet now, though the city outside still murmurs and moans with its nocturnal life. You step deeper into the private quarters, where torchlight glows low and oil lamps burn with a sweetness that barely masks the human heat gathering behind heavy curtains. Here, in Cleopatra's inner chambers, the concerns of politics and empire dissolve into something older, more primal. Desire. The body, with all its needs, its smells, its fragile illusions of beauty, becomes the battlefield. There is no avoiding the simple fact: the ancient bedroom was not clean. The perfumes, the oils, the garlands of flowers, all were desperate defenses against the reality of human intimacy without the modern comforts of soap or sterilization. The closer you look, the clearer it becomes that sex in antiquity was not a perfumed fantasy, but a mingling of sweat, unwashed skin, and the constant presence of disease. And yet Cleopatra wielded this world as her weapon. Imagine her, waiting for Caesar or Antony, her body already anointed, her skin glistening from a mixture of unguents, some smooth with almond oil, some sticky with resins drawn from Arabia. She has stained her lips with red pigment, her eyes thick with kohl. Her hair is heavy with oils that reek faintly of rancid olives beneath the fragrance of jasmine. She lies on linen sheets that have been beaten clean in the Nile, but not truly washed. They carry the faint scent of mildew, the ghost of river water clinging, no matter how often they are sun-dried. And then the lover arrives. A man who has spent weeks on campaign, who reeks of leather and horse sweat, whose cloak is stiff with dust, whose body has rarely known a proper wash. He smells of iron from weapons, of wine seeping through his pores, of the stale wool he has worn without pause. In any other setting, his presence would be repulsive. But here, in the glow of lamplight, Cleopatra transforms the scene. She does not erase the filth, she drowns it. She overwhelms his senses with perfumes and oils until the illusion of cleanliness overtakes the truth. The kiss, though, betrays reality. There is no avoiding the roughness of teeth not brushed, gums stained by wine, the soreness of a mouth gone unwashed. They did not have toothbrushes as we do, a sprig of mint chewed, perhaps, or a rinse of water with natron. But breath was rarely fresh. The mingling of mouths was an act both erotic and rancid, and yet desire made it bearable, even intoxicating. The body follows. Their skin, slick with oil, hides the underlying film of sweat and dirt. Clothes fall away, linen and wool bearing the smells of long wear. Cleopatra's body, though tended, is still human, still carrying the faint soreness of the day, the musk of her own heat. There is no fantasy of sterility here. The bed is where flesh confronts flesh, and the reality of ancient intimacy is sticky, salty, raw. But the queen understood this, and she turned it into theatre. Every act was ritualized. She could seduce by smell alone, letting the waft of her unguents precede her entry into a room. She could intoxicate by sight, by layering gold dust into her makeup so her skin glittered in lamplight. And in the bed itself, she played the part of the goddess. For Cleopatra was not merely a woman. She was Isis made flesh, the embodiment of Egypt's divine femininity. Her lovers did not simply couple with her, they worshipped her. Even the filth became sanctified when wrapped in her performance. Still, the practical side of sex was not glamorous. Sheets stained easily. Blood, sweat, oil, seed. They were seldom washed between encounters, and the smell of past lovers lingered. Servants might replace the coverings, but the chamber itself was steeped in the memory of bodies. The air grew thick with it, musk layered upon musk. Perfume was the only cleanser, and always there was the unspoken threat of disease. The ancients had no true understanding of infection, though they feared the signs, sores, discharges, fevers that followed lust. Remedies were bizarre and brutal. Crocodile dung again served as a pessary. Honey was smeared as both antiseptic and lubricant. Vinegar rinses were attempted, stinging and ineffective. Women were told to squat over smoke or steam, to purge themselves of the unseen poisons of sex. Men chewed herbs, drank potions, smeared resins on their genitals. None of it worked. Desire always outran medicine. Yet Cleopatra, for all the risk, embraced this world with abandon. For her, sex was not only pleasure, it was strategy. Julius Caesar did not fall for her because of military genius alone. Mark Antony did not abandon Rome for nothing. Each man was drawn into the web of her body, her scent, her performance. And though her bedroom reeked of the same humanity as any other, she made it a stage where filth was forgotten. The rituals extended beyond the act itself. After sex, there was always the cleanup, an awkward, unglamorous necessity. Water was fetched, cloths soaked, oils reapplied. Without plumbing, this was a clumsy task. A servant might carry in a basin the water already stale. Lovers wiped themselves with linen rags, which were then tossed aside, reused until they could be discarded. There was no secrecy in this. Slaves hovered near, aware of every detail, forced into the role of silent witnesses. Intimacy was never truly private, it was communal, observed, facilitated, and remembered. The smell after was always the same: extinguished lamps, cooling sweat, the faint acrid tang of sex itself. No perfume could disguise it fully. The queen might summon musicians, drown the room in incense, or call for wine to distract her guest. But the truth lingered. And yet, to her lovers, this truth was divine. To touch Cleopatra was to touch Egypt. To inhale her body was to taste power itself. Even the filth was sanctified. The broader world of Egyptian sexuality was no cleaner. In the poorer quarters, lovers met in alleys, in cramped rooms, on mats shared by entire families. Privacy was rare, bodies pressed together in shadow, unwashed, fevered. Diseases spread easily. Pregnancies were frequent and abortions dangerous. Herbs, sharp instruments, desperate prayers, all were tried. Women died quietly, their names forgotten, buried beneath the Nile's endless silt. For most, sex was not divine but survival, a fleeting escape from hardship. And yet, there was laughter too. Jokes carved into pottery, graffiti scrawled on walls, phalluses, crude drawings, playful boasts. People mocked their own filth, turned it into humor. They sang bawdy songs at festivals, lifted skirts in drunken parody, worshipped fertility gods with obscene statues. Sex was not only sacred or sordid, it was communal, messy, human. Cleopatra lived in both worlds at once. She knew the filth intimately, but she masked it better than anyone. Her lovers believed in her illusions, because they wanted to. They needed to. For in her bed, amid the unwashed breath and the sticky heat, they could forget the rot of their cities, the stench of their campaigns, the decay of their empires. With her, filth became perfume and desire became destiny, and so the bedroom of Cleopatra was not just a chamber. It was an alchemy. Flesh into power, sweat into strategy, filth into seduction. The sheets may have reeked, the water may have been stale, the bodies unwashed. But history was written there, in the mingling of scent and skin. Rome itself bent to her, not only through armies and treaties, but through the ancient, unclean, irresistible intimacy of the bed. The torches flicker lower. The queen reclines, a lover at her side, the air heavy with all that has passed. You realize, with a kind of awe, that history itself was born in filth. Empires rose and fell in beds that smelled no different than this one. rank, sweet, raw, human. Cleopatra's perfume may have gilded it, but beneath the jasmine and honey, the truth always lingered. The past is not clean. It never was. And so you drift with that truth, drowsy, lulled by the hum of a distant lyre, the faint crackle of dying lamps, the warm closeness of bodies that once ruled the world. The bedroom fades, the smells soften, the illusion holds, and history whispers you to sleep. The palace walls were meant to shine. Marble-polished smooth floors washed with river water, mosaics swept free of dust by obedient hands. Yet no matter how often the servants toiled, the truth pressed in from every corner. Egypt, like Rome, like every ancient empire, lived under the constant weight of filth. Cleopatra may have floated through incense, filled halls, her skin glowing with oils, her voice measured with charm, but beneath her sandals the grit of the world never truly disappeared. Outside her palace, Alexandria seethed. The streets were narrow and choked, filled with merchants crying their wares, beggars stretching out diseased hands, donkeys urinating as they hauled carts through the press of bodies. Fish markets reeked of rotting scales, their scraps tossed into the gutters. The sun beat down, and the smell fermented until the whole quarter stank of decay. Slaves carried waste out of homes and dumped it into pits, but the pits overflowed, and so waste spilled into the alleys, into the canals, into the harbour itself. Cleopatra's capital was a jewel of the Mediterranean, but it was a jewel set in muck. In her palace, the queen attempted to escape this reality with rituals of cleanliness that were as much performance as necessity. Each morning, her attendants brought basins of Nile water, already brackish with silt, sometimes mixed with wine to soften its odour. They rubbed her with cloths soaked in perfumed oil, scraping away the night's sweat, wiping away the flakes of skin and grit that clung to her body. But this was no bath in the modern sense. It was a veneer of cleanliness, a thin disguise. The oils themselves grew rancid in the heat. The cloths carried yesterday's residue. What lingered beneath the perfumes never truly left. Yet for Cleopatra, as for all rulers of her time, illusion was everything. To her subjects, she appeared as radiant Isis, untouched by the dirt that plagued ordinary lives. They never saw the oil stains under her arms, the way sweat gathered at the crook of her knees, the faint mildew that clung to linens stored too long in humid rooms. Her attendants washed these things away, or rather covered them, transforming filth into glamour. It was not truth they sold, but a vision. The reality of hygiene in Cleopatra's Egypt was brutal. Soap as we know it did not exist. Instead, natron, a mixture of salt and minerals gathered from dry lake beds, was rubbed onto the skin. It stung, dried the flesh, left it raw. The wealthy softened it with oils, making a paste that could both cleanse and scent the body. But for the poor, there was no luxury. A quick rinse in the Nile, a rub of natron if it could be afforded, and the rest was left to the sun. The river was both lifeblood and sewer. Animals waded in it, washing their hides. Corpses drifted downstream. Women did laundry in the same water from which they drank. To immerse oneself was to emerge marked with its filth. And yet, Egyptians revered cleanliness in ritual. Priests shaved their entire bodies, bathing several times a day before entering temples. They were forbidden from carrying the dirt of ordinary life into sacred spaces. Their cleanliness was a symbol of separation, a barrier between the divine and the mortal. But even here, the tools were crude sharp bronze razors that cut the skin, leading to sores, water mixed with natron that cracked and burned. Cleanliness was painful, imperfect, yet it was demanded by the gods. Cleopatra inherited these traditions and wove them into her own image. When she presented herself to Caesar, descending from her carpet wrappings, she was more than a queen. She was a body purified by ritual, perfumed with frankincense and myrrh, dazzling in her gilded cosmetics. He did not see the sores hidden beneath her jewelry, the grit pressed into her feet from the long journey. He saw only divinity. The illusion was complete, but the reality persisted. Insects thrived in this world. Lice crawled through wigs and into bedding. Fleas carried fevers. Mosquitoes spread disease with every bite, their whining presence a nightly torment. Even Cleopatra, protected by nets and slaves who fanned her while she slept, could not escape them entirely. Her chamber may have been scented with roses, but in the shadows, vermin scuttled. Rats gnawed at the storerooms, leaving droppings where grain was kept. Flies swarmed around uncovered food. Cleanliness was not possible, only control, only appearances. The queen's lovers faced the same indignities. Caesar, coming from Roman camps, brought with him the stench of latrines dug too shallow, the dust of unwashed soldiers, the grime of constant marching. Antony, famously indulgent, carried the sweat of feasts, the oil of greasy meats, the sour tang of too much wine. Cleopatra may have embraced them, but she embraced their filth as well. The sheets of her bed became the repository of empire, Roman dirt mingling with Egyptian dust, Greek sweat mingling with Nile oils. History itself was stained into the linens. And then there was the matter of the body's own betrayals. Toothaches plagued the ancient world. Without proper care, gums swelled, teeth blackened, breath grew foul. Cleopatra herself was rumored to have a sharp nose and strong features. Whether her breath was sweet, no one could truly know. But perfumes were not only for the body. Some were chewed to mask the mouth's decay. Still, when lovers kissed, they tasted more than desire. They tasted rot. Excrement was everywhere. Latrines existed in Alexandria, some public, some private, but they were breeding grounds of stench. Flies swarmed, diseases multiplied. Most Egyptians relieved themselves in pits or open spaces, covering the waste with sand. Even in the palace, chamber pots were used, emptied by slaves into cesspits that overflowed in the heat. The smell never truly disappeared. It clung to courtyards, seeped into walls, drifted through the streets. No amount of incense could fully disguise it. Cleopatra lived among marble, but marble that carried the odor of human life, pressed too closely together. The irony was sharp. Egypt was obsessed with purity, yet it lived in filth. The dead were embalmed with meticulous care, wrapped in resins and spices to prevent decay, while the living fought endlessly against the rot that surrounded them. Priests purified themselves before rituals, but then walked through streets ankle deep in waste. Cleopatra painted herself as a goddess, yet had to mask the same bodily smells as any woman. Her genius was that she turned this universal struggle into a symbol of power. Where others stank, she perfumed. Where others were seen in their filth, she cloaked hers in gold and linen. She made the ordinary grotesque into something transcendent. Even her supposed baths in milk, whether true or not, spoke to this. Milk would curdle quickly in the heat, turning sour, its smell thick and unpleasant. To imagine Cleopatra reclining in such liquid is not to imagine freshness, but a sour, sweet mixture of rot and luxury. Yet this image endured, because it elevated filth into extravagance. What was disgusting became divine through her. The people around her lived the opposite. A fisherman's wife rose each morning and scrubbed herself quickly in Nile water, the fish, guts from her husband's catch clinging to her skin. She wrapped herself in linen that had been washed in the same river and hung to dry in the smoke of their hearth. Her children scratched lice from their hair, their bellies bloated from parasites. The family ate bread dark with grit from the millstones, food that wore away their teeth and left their mouths raw. Their home was one room, heavy with the smell of sweat, urine, and smoke. For them, filth was not a disguise, it was life itself. Cleopatra floated above this, but she never truly escaped it. Even the most perfumed queen carried in her body the same hungers, the same sweat, the same decay. She bled each month, as every woman did, using wads of linen or papyrus softened with oils, then cast aside. She endured the same risk of infection, the same vulnerability to fevers that rose without warning. She may have commanded empires, but she could not command her own biology. And perhaps this is why her story still captivates. Not because she was untouched by filth, but because she mastered it. She transformed it into theater, into seduction, into power. The world around her stank of waste, sweat, and decay, yet she convinced great men that they were breathing in the perfume of divinity. She made them forget the gnaw of rats in the walls, the mosquitoes whining outside, the stink of unwashed bodies pressing in the streets. With her, filth was invisible, consumed by illusion. But we, peering back through time, can smell it still. The perfumes do not reach us. The oils have faded. What remains is the truth that ancient life was unclean, and that history itself was written by those who could disguise that fact best. Cleopatra was not clean. She was not untouched. She was filth transformed, sweat gilded with gold, rot hidden under roses, the stink of empire wrapped in linen. And as the night deepens, you feel it pressing in the hum of flies, the warmth of bodies, the sharp tang of natron, the soreness of milk baths, the unwashed breath of kings. You see her lying on her couch, smiling faintly, as if daring you to notice what lies beneath the perfume. To see not only the goddess but the woman, not only the illusion but the filth. And you realize that this was her greatest power, not to erase the truth, but to make you love it anyway. So history whispers in the dark, carrying with it the stink of centuries. Empires rise and fall, but the human smell never leaves. Cleopatra ruled through it, shrouded it, transformed it into legend, and in the end, when you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, you understand that the past was never clean. It was beautiful in its filth, and terrible and human. You would think by now you'd have grown accustomed to the smell. But no, Alexandria always surprises you. There is the salt of the sea, sharp and bracing, trying so hard to cover the scent of donkey droppings baked into the sunlit streets. A fishmonger is shouting, his hands slick with scales, and beside him a group of slaves scrub amphora with sand. You pause, wondering whether their scoring is doing anything at all. Probably not. Everything smells faintly like something that died 2 weeks ago and was politely invited to linger. It is into this world that Cleopatra's personal hygiene habits become both fascinating and revolting. For the queen who wanted to be seen as a goddess, every gesture was a balancing act between divinity and decay. You see, in a time without toothbrushes, deodorant, or soap in our modern sense, cleanliness was largely a performance. If people believed you were beautiful and pure, that counted as being clean. But let us not be fooled. Underneath the lotus oil and the incense, there was plenty going on that you would rather not think about while eating dinner. Take her famous baths, for example. The legend of Cleopatra bathing in ass's milk isn't just poetic fantasy. It was recorded by several Roman sources, though they might have exaggerated the scale. Imagine hundreds of donkeys milked daily just so Cleopatra could slip into a bath that started to sour the moment it was poured. The milk itself, rich and cloying, would cling to the skin. For the first few moments, perhaps it smelled faintly sweet, even luxurious. But under the Egyptian sun, with no refrigeration, milk turns quickly. By the time she stepped out, she was coated not only in supposed beauty enzymes, but also in the early stages of cottage cheese. And yet people swore she glowed afterward. Maybe it was the lactic acid gently exfoliating her skin. Or maybe people were simply too afraid to tell her she smelled like a spoiled dairy shop. Imagine walking into a modern cafe, ordering a latte, and having someone hand you a Cleopatra bath instead. You'd demand a refund. She, however, leaned into it, and courtiers praised the scent as exotic, divine, mysterious. That's one way to make sour milk fashionable, just be a queen. Perfume played a role too. Cleopatra was obsessed with fragrance. Not just to seduce but to mask the realities of living in a city where sewers were optional. The Egyptians were masters of perfumery, distilling oils from lotus, myrrh, cinnamon, and frankincense. But imagine the mixture of sweating under linen gowns, sleeping in smoky palaces, and layering perfume until it was less delicate whisper of fragrance and more headache-inducing wall of scent. In fact, some Roman writers joked that you could smell Cleopatra's arrival before you saw her. That sounds glamorous in poetry, but in practice, it probably meant she reeked of an overpowering incense cloud, while everyone else was gagging quietly in the background. Still, perfume was preferable to the alternative body odor. Because here's the thing, regular bathing wasn't what you might imagine. Egyptians bathed, yes, but mostly by rinsing with cold water or wiping with oils, and scraping with curved bronze tools. Soap, in the modern sense, didn't exist. They had something like it. Clay mixed with oils. But it was more exfoliating paste than lather. So if Cleopatra wanted to freshen up, it usually meant layering scented oils, wiping with cloth, and hoping the sun did not undo her efforts in 15 minutes. Think of it as the ancient version of spraying deodorant over yesterday's shirt instead of doing laundry. Effective enough for appearances, but hardly squeaky clean. Speaking of laundry, that deserves its own moment. Linen, the fabric of Egypt, was light and breathable, but it also absorbed sweat and dust like a sponge. The elite had servants constantly washing their clothes in Nile water mixed with natron, a naturally occurring soda ash. It worked as a cleansing agent but left clothes stiff and scratchy. And that's if you were lucky. More often, Garments carried a faint yellow hue of perspiration no amount of scrubbing could erase. Cleopatra's dresses may have looked ethereal in frescoes, but in real life, they probably smelled faintly of sour milk, incense, and human effort. Let us not overlook the matter of teeth. Cleopatra's famous smile, the one poets rhapsodized about, was almost certainly less than pearly white. Ancient Egyptians did have some form of dental paste, made of crushed pumice, salt, and sometimes ash. It did clean, but also shredded the enamel, leaving teeth worn down and sensitive. Add to this the Egyptian bread, which was ground on sandstone, leaving it full of grit. Every bite was like chewing sandpaper. Dental decay was common, abscesses frequent, and halitosis practically a national pastime. Imagine Cleopatra whispering sweet nothings to Mark Antony, while her breath suggested last night's fish and this morning's donkey milk rinse. Romantic. Perhaps less so up close. Hair, too, was both a weapon and a battlefield. Cleopatra likely wore wigs woven from human hair, perfumed and carefully styled. Wigs allowed variety and grandeur, but they also harbored lice. Yes, lice were a problem across the ancient world, and wigs were prime real estate. Servants combed them with ivory picks, sometimes soaking them in oils to drown the pests. But nothing worked perfectly. You can picture the queen sitting at court, radiant, commanding, while one hand discreetly scratched her wig line. Even goddesses itch. Of course. Her personal chambers were filled with the trappings of beauty. Alabaster jars of ointments, carved combs, painted mirrors. But underneath, the rituals were as much about survival as allure. In a climate where water was scarce, sewage systems crude, and disease rampant, the line between glamorous and grotesque was thin. Cleopatra's supposed radiance was largely a battle against rot. And here's the strangest part. The filth itself became part of her mystique. Romans, who prided themselves on baths and marble cleanliness, still found themselves enchanted by Cleopatra's world of oils, smoke, and exotic substances. Perhaps it was the sheer contrast. To them, she seemed dangerous, alluring, almost magical. The truth, that she smelled like incense covering spoiled milk, with a hint of gingivitis, was less important than the aura she projected. She knew how to weaponize her habits, turning disgust into desire, and that, more than any donkey milk, was her greatest cosmetic. But imagine, if you will, the everyday reality. You, wandering through her palace, catch a whiff of the kitchens. Roasting geese, stale bread, honey drizzled too thickly. You step past servants scrubbing chamber pots, the acrid sting of ammonia in the air. In her private rooms, the queen reclines, skin oiled, lips red with crushed carmine. She beckons, and you step closer. She smiles, and suddenly you notice the faint soreness, the perfume sharp enough to sting your nose, the wig smelling faintly of smoke and sweat. You smile back, because what else can you do? She is Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, embodiment of Isis. And if your eyes water, well, you can always claim it is from her radiant beauty, rather than the scent of donkey milk gone wrong. It's almost comforting, isn't it? To know that the most legendary beauty of the ancient world shared the same struggles we do: bad breath, stubborn stains, questionable skincare. Only she had the power to turn all of it into seduction. Today, we swipe on deodorant and toothpaste. She relied on incense and natron. We swipe right on apps. She swiped donkey dung on wounds. Times change, but humanity's little gross habits remain eternal. And yet, if you think sour milk baths and perfume clouds were the height of disturbing, you haven't yet seen what waited in her kitchens. Because the queen's diet, too, left its mark, not just on her table, but on her hygiene in ways you might wish to forget. It is one thing to oil your skin, to drown yourself in perfume, to recline in baths of donkey milk that turn sour within the hour. It is another thing entirely to consider the consequences of what you eat. And Cleopatra ate like a queen. That is not to say she always ate well by modern standards, or that her meals would appeal to us today. In fact, her diet, rich in sugar-laden dates, honey, soaked cakes, and heavy roasted meats, probably did her no favors when it came to digestion. What she consumed shaped not just her figure, but her odor, her health, her breath, and, though people rarely think of this, her hygiene. The Egyptian elite believed that food was not merely nourishment but medicine, a form of magic, even a declaration of identity. To eat figs was to commune with sweetness itself. To eat Nile fish was to embody the river's abundance. Cleopatra, however, was not simply an Egyptian noblewoman. She was queen, and her table needed to display power as well as satisfy hunger. Banquets for foreign dignitaries were stage spectacles, almost performances of excess. Great dishes of roasted goose, lamb dripping with fat, and platters of dates, almonds, figs, and pomegranates spilled across polished tables. Wine, imported from Greece, was poured with abandon. But imagine for a moment what this meant inside the body. Egypt was hot. Meat spoiled quickly. Even salted and spiced. A roast goose by the Nile did not have the longevity of a neatly refrigerated chicken breast today. By the time it reached Cleopatra's plate, even a queen's food might already be harboring bacteria. The flavor was disguised with cinnamon, honey, and cumin, but the stomach knew the truth. What followed was often bloating, gas, and indigestion. Ancient medical papyri are filled with remedies for belly complaints, suggesting that upset stomachs were as common as sand on the banks of the river. If Cleopatra's famed charm could turn men to ruin, one can imagine what her digestion might have turned into after such feasts. Heavy meat, honey, drenched pastries, dates sticky with sugar, it all led to fermentation inside the body. There were no probiotics to soothe her gut, no mint-flavored antacids waiting by her bedside. Instead, physicians offered remedies made from crushed herbs, natron dissolved in water, or even mixtures of ground dates with wine. The result was less relief and more a continuation of the cycle, bloating treated with wine, wine creating its own hangovers, hangovers treated with more heavy food. And here we arrive at the matter of elimination. You cannot eat like a queen without producing waste like a queen. It is easy to imagine Cleopatra only as the glamorous goddess reclining in painted frescoes, never as a human being who needed to excuse herself after too many figs. Yet reality was otherwise. Toilets existed, yes, but they were primitive clay pots emptied by slaves, or stone seats leading to cesspits that reeked in the summer heat. Even in her palace, the queen would have relied on attendants to handle what polite history does not mention. And while she may have perfumed her chambers, the stench of waste was never far from anyone's life in the ancient world. The Egyptians did try to manage it. Natron, the same mineral used to wash clothes and embalm mummies, was sprinkled into chamber pots to reduce smell. But think of the logistics: a royal household of hundreds, maybe thousands, producing waste every day. Servants carried it out, sometimes to be dumped into the Nile under cover of darkness. Cleopatra's palace was magnificent, but beneath the incense and gilded columns, there was always a river of filth flowing just out of sight. Now return to her table. Think of the garlic. Garlic was a staple of Egyptian cooking, believed to strengthen the body. Roman writers complained that Egyptians reeked of it. If Cleopatra ate garlic, and there is little doubt she did, it would linger on her breath, seep through her pores, and cling to her hair. Combined with wine and spoiled meat, her scent was likely as complex as her politics. A heady mix of rot and roses, honey and sweat milk and musk. Her teeth, already ground down by bread filled with grit, would have trapped food particles. Without dental floss or modern toothbrushes, bits of lamb fat, pomegranate seeds, and sticky dates could linger for days. Egyptian dentists recommended rinses of crushed herbs, but the effect was temporary. The sweetness of honey cakes turned to tooth decay, the crunch of sandy bread wore enamel down to stumps. Cleopatra smiled. Yes, but if you stood close, you may have seen gums inflamed, teeth darkened, and breath sour with rot. Digestion itself was an obsession of Egyptian medicine. Constipation, diarrhea, stomach cramps, all were treated with elaborate recipes. Some called for castor oil, others for figs, still others for mixtures of cow's milk and honey. There is evidence that enemas were common, delivered with reed tubes, sometimes in elaborate ritual contexts. Was Cleopatra subjected to such treatments? Almost certainly. Even queens could not escape constipation, and her physicians, schooled in the traditions of Imhotep, would have offered such cleansings as part of maintaining divine balance in the body. Imagine the scene: the Queen of Egypt, daughter of Isis, submitting to a reed tube enema in hopes of clearing a stomach full of spoiled goose. It strips away the glamour rather quickly, does it not? And yet, the paradox remains: her power was not diminished by these realities. If anything, it is magnified by the thought that she could suffer the same indigestions and odorous embarrassments as anyone else, yet still enthralled Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She turned a body that sweated, stank, and bloated into an icon of divinity. That transformation required as much psychological manipulation as physical allure. But there is one more aspect of her diet that often goes overlooked: her experiments. Cleopatra was fascinated by medicine, even by poison. Some sources suggest she tested toxic herbs on prisoners, curious about their effects. If that is true, she may also have experimented with diets and remedies for herself, consuming strange concoctions of herbs, honey, or vinegar. Some of these may have aided digestion. Others may have worsened it. Vinegar, for example, was believed to aid weight control. Taken in excess, it can erode teeth, sour the stomach, and leave a person weak. Did Cleopatra sip vinegar in hopes of preserving her figure? It would not be out of character. Her legacy, then, is not simply one of beauty but of endurance. To eat as she did was to court discomfort. Yet she emerged from each banquet still radiant, still commanding. Her attendants surely managed the aftermath, scrubbing stained linens, emptying chamber pots, burning incense to disguise the scent of digestive consequences. Behind the curtain of splendor, an entire system labored to keep the queen's bodily realities invisible. Still, the body always tells its secrets. Bloating, bad breath, bouts of diarrhea, or the unmistakable odor of garlic and wine sweating through the skin. These were companions as constant as her gilded jewelry. The Egyptians saw no contradiction. The divine and the disgusting coexisted, just as lotus blossoms floated on Nile waters, teeming with crocodiles and decay. And so Cleopatra's hygiene was not only about perfumes and ointments. It was also about digestion, about the unglamorous cycle of consumption and elimination. To picture her at her table, leaning back on cushions, fingers sticky with dates, lips stained with wine, is to remember that what dazzled the eye might not have delighted the nose. What she ate shaped her scent, her smile, her health. And what she left behind, well, that was handled quickly, discreetly, by servants who surely had stories they never dared tell. In the end, Cleopatra's greatest feat may not have been seducing powerful men or commanding vast armies. It may have been convincing the world that sour milk baths, garlic breath, and the aftermath of honey cakes belonged not to a mortal woman, but to a goddess. For what goes in must come out. But Cleopatra knew how to ensure that nobody remembered the smell, only the myth. Cleopatra was not just a queen. She was a performance, a spectacle, an illusion carefully constructed from color, scent, and light. To see her enter a room was to see divinity itself walk among mortals. But behind that shimmering vision was a truth both fascinating and grotesque. Her beauty was, quite literally, painted on. And the paints she used, they were toxic, unhygienic, and dangerous in ways that modern science can only marvel at with a shudder. In ancient Egypt, cosmetics were not a luxury. They were a necessity, woven into every layer of life. Even peasants ground malachite for a dab of green eye paint, or smeared red ochre across their lips before a festival. But Cleopatra's cosmetics cabinet was something else entirely. Hers was a treasury of jars, pots, and palettes carved from alabaster and decorated with inlaid lapis lazuli. Within them were powders, oils, and pigments ground to a deadly fineness. Beauty was power, and she wielded it ruthlessly. Yet every stroke of kohl across her eyelid, every smear of rouge upon her lips, carried hidden costs. Costs paid by her skin, her health, and her hygiene. Let us begin with her eyes. Cleopatra's kohl is legendary, that thick, black rim that made her gaze burn like a torch in darkness. It was more than decoration, it was identity. Painted eyes were not simply beautiful, they were magical. The dark outline warded off the glare of the sun, kept away the evil eye, and signaled divine protection. To wear kohl was to embody Horus, falcon-eyed god of the sky. Cleopatra would never have been seen without it. But what exactly was in this kohl? The recipe was simple and sinister: ground galena, lead sulfide it, mixed with animal fat or plant oil until it formed a paste. Sometimes soot or charcoal was added for extra darkness. On the skin, it clung like tar. But through the skin, it seeped into the body. Lead sulfide is no harmless mineral. It is toxic. Over time, it builds up in the bloodstream, weakening the immune system, clouding the mind, and causing fatigue. Cleopatra, in adorning herself, may have been slowly poisoning herself. Imagine the daily ritual. Slaves grinding lead ore into a fine powder, their own lungs filling with dust as they worked. The paste applied with a delicate ivory stick, dragged across the tender skin of Cleopatra's eyelid. Day after day, the paint flaked and smeared, rubbed away by sweat, only to be reapplied again. The skin beneath, suffocated and inflamed, grew sore. Infections brewed. Even Roman physicians noted that excessive eye paint caused swelling and discharge. Yet Cleopatra could not appear bare-eyed. To do so would have been like stripping away her throne itself. And so she endured the irritation, the itching, the occasional crusting of pus at the corner of her eye, all in service of the gaze that conquered Caesar and Antony. Next, her lips. Red was the color of vitality, of blood, of seduction. Cleopatra's lips were said to gleam with crimson, made from a mixture of crushed carmine beetles and red ochre. This produced a shade vivid enough to stand out even by torchlight. But here, too, lurked discomfort. Ground beetles left a gritty texture, while ochre was mixed with vinegar or gum resin to adhere to the skin. The result? Chapped lips, cracked edges, and a mouth that stung with every smile. The desert sun only worsened the dryness. Cleopatra's attendants were forced to constantly reapply bombs of honey and wax to keep her lips from splitting into sores. Perfumes were another weapon in her arsenal, and here the line between allure and revulsion blurred further. Egyptian perfumes were not light sprays or airy mists. They were heavy oils, thick with resin, musk, and myrrh, smeared onto skin until it glistened. Cleopatra was rumored to soak the sails of her ships with perfume, so that when she approached Antony, the air itself carried her scent. But to modern noses, that perfume may not have been entirely pleasant. Without chemical stabilizers, the oils went rancid quickly. Myrrh soared in the heat. Musk curdled into an animal reek. What began as seductive soon turned cloying, overwhelming, almost nauseating. And beneath the mask of perfume, there was always the body itself, sweat, oil, and the lingering trace of spoiled milk baths. Perfume did not remove these odors. It merely smothered them under a heavier one. Then there was her skin. Queens must glow, and Cleopatra's glow was painted on. Her attendants prepared creams of animal fat, mixed with ground alabaster to whiten her face. The pale skin was meant to contrast with the black coal, to shine like the moon. But alabaster is abrasive. Smeared daily it wore at the skin, leaving it raw. Worse, some whitening creams contained ceruse, another form of lead, this time lead carbonate. Ceruse smoothed wrinkles, yes, but at the cost of corroding the skin beneath. Women who used it for years often developed sores, scarring, and premature aging, the very thing they sought to avoid. Cleopatra, too, may have been masking blemishes created by the very paints she applied. It is worth pausing here to consider the logistics. How often was she painted? Not once a day, but several times. After a hot morning audience, her face would have smeared with sweat. Attendants wiped it clean, reapplied the powders, refreshed the oils. Before a banquet, more paint. Before bed, perfumes and unguents smeared across her body to prevent drying. Her skin never truly breathed. It was a canvas constantly repainted, cleaned not with soap but with abrasive natron or vinegar rinses. The pores clogged, the oils curdled, the stench grew. Hygiene was not cleanliness, it was concealment. Even her nails were not free from artifice. They were painted with henna, stained a reddish brown. Pretty, yes. But henna was often mixed with other plant extracts, some of which irritated the cuticles and left the nails brittle. Fingers sticky with honey. Lips cracking from beetle, dye, eyes burning with lead paste. This was the reality beneath the image of a goddess. And then there was her hair. Cleopatra's hair was not always her own. Wigs were common, crafted from human hair or palm fibers coated in resin. They were perfumed and oiled, braided into elaborate crowns. But wigs trap heat. They itch, they become breeding grounds for lice. Insects nested in the resin, gnats swarmed to the perfume. Beneath the wig, Cleopatra's scalp sweated, her hair matted. Her attendants likely washed her hair with concoctions of crushed lupin or fenugreek. But in a climate like Egypt's, freshness lasted only hours. Once again, perfume was applied, not cleanliness achieved. When one gathers all of these rituals together, a picture emerges not of radiant perfection, but of constant, exhausting maintenance. Cleopatra's beauty was a battle against her own body. Every pigment was toxic, every perfume short-lived, every cream corrosive. Yet she persevered. Her ability to cloak herself in this painted illusion, to convince others of her godlike beauty, was not simply a matter of biology. It was willpower, discipline, and an entire army of servants complicit in sustaining the Farhade. Imagine then the private reality. behind closed doors, away from Roman generals and Egyptian priests. Cleopatra must have felt the sting of cracked lips, the itch of lead, painted eyes, the sour reek of spoiled perfume. Perhaps she groaned as her scalp burned from resin-coated wigs, or rubbed her belly raw with natron to scrub away oil. These were the costs of power. And unlike her diamonds and jewels, these costs could not be pawned off onto slaves. They were carried in her skin, her blood, her very breath. The paradox of Cleopatra's cosmetics. Is this what made her unforgettable may also have hastened her decay? Lead poisoning brings fatigue, irritability, and even infertility. Mercury-based skin creams can cause tremors and madness. Cleopatra, painted each day with toxins, perfumed with rotting oils, may have paid with her health for the power her beauty bought her. If history remembers her as radiant, it is only because the discomfort was buried beneath silk, gold, and myth. And yet there is something almost admirable in that. To turn poison into power, rot into radiance, fellness into fascination. That is the alchemy Cleopatra mastered. She taught the world that beauty need not be real to be effective. It only needed to be convincing. Even if her painted eyes itched, even if her perfumes curdled, even if her lips cracked and her scalp crawled with lice, none of it mattered so long as Caesar believed she was divine. The cosmetics of Cleopatra, then, were less about hygiene than about illusion. They did not cleanse, they concealed. They did not heal, they harmed. But they achieved their purpose, they transformed a mortal woman, with all the odors and blemishes of mortality, into something larger than life. And that, more than anything else, was her greatest seduction. The image of Cleopatra that history loves to preserve is one of endless grandeur, gilded halls lit by flickering lamps, columns painted with lotus and papyrus, and floors polished to a mirror's shine. We picture her reclining on couches draped in silk, dining on exotic fruits, while music played from every corner. And in truth, the palace of Cleopatra was a marvel. It stood on the edge of the great harbor of Alexandria, the sea itself glittering at its feet. It was the beating heart of Ptolemaic power, the place where ambassadors bowed, generals plotted, and Rome itself trembled at the sight of its queen. But if you step inside those marble doors, if you move past the image painted by poets and propagandists, you find something else. A palace is a city in miniature, and cities are never clean. Within the same walls that dazzled Caesar, vermin ran across storerooms, kitchens reeked of smoke and fish, drains clogged with rot, and courtyards buzzed with swarms of flies fattened on scraps. Cleopatra's palace was no exception. The splendor was real, but so was the stench. Let us begin with the dining halls. Cleopatra's banquets were legendary, crafted as displays of excess to eye her guests. Imagine tables stretching into candlelit distance, laden with roasted peacocks, whole fish, figs split and dripping honey, pyramids of pomegranates, loaves perfumed with coriander. But the truth is less appetizing. Without refrigeration, much of this food spoiled quickly in Alexandria's heat. Fish pulled from the Nile or the harbor was sometimes days old, its flesh already softening. Meat roasted and spiced could mask decay, but only for so long. Honey was poured over fruits not simply to sweeten them, but to hide bruises, blemishes, and the faint soreness of overripe skins. What happened to the scraps after the feast? They were not carried away to hygienic disposal. They were thrown into middens in the palace grounds, or dumped into trenches for dogs and pigs to scavenge. In the night, rats descended in droves. They gnawed at fish bones, tore into half-eaten figs, scuttled across flagstones slick with grease. Servants swept, yes, but in sweeping only scattered crumbs into cracks where vermin thrived. So while guests reclined on couches and sang praises of Cleopatra's hospitality just beneath the marble surface, an invisible army of rats and insects feasted alongside them. And where there is food, there are flies. Egypt was plagued with them. Tiny black bodies that swarmed in clouds, drawn to anything sweet, sticky, or decaying. The palace kitchens were filled with their hum. Servants fanned the air constantly, trying to keep flies from landing on platters before they reached Cleopatra's table. At banquets, slaves stood with palm fronds to wave them away, a silent battle waged over every dish. Yet flies cannot be banished entirely. They landed on the wine, drowned in the honey, crawled across the bread. Guests brushed them away without remark, for this was simply life in Egypt. Splendor and squalor coexisted in the same breath. The floors themselves were a paradox. In great halls, polished limestone shone under lamplight, but polish does not prevent filth. Guests dragged dust and dung in on their sandals. Oil spilled from lamps left slick stains. Dogs and cats, kept to control vermin, sometimes soiled the corners. Slaves scrubbed constantly with natron and vinegar, their knees raw from hours on the stone. Yet the smell never fully left. Beneath the fragrance of frankincense, beneath the sweetness of myrrh, there was always the faint, sour undertone of damp stone, old food, and animal waste. Then there were the private chambers. To us, they might seem the height of luxury: beds draped with linen, floors scattered with rugs from the east, bronze mirrors shining in the lamplight. But comfort came with its own price. The linens, washed in river water, stiffened with mineral deposits and retained the faint must of mildew. The rugs, rich with dyes, absorbed spills and odors until they stank of sweat, wine, and the smoke of countless lamps. Even Cleopatra herself, reclining in her private rooms, breathed the mingled scent of luxury and decay. The greatest source of palace filth, however, was the same plague of every ancient dwelling: sewage. Alexandria was a marvel of engineering, with aqueducts and underground channels, but plumbing was far from foolproof. Drains clogged easily. Latrines overflowed. Chamber pots, used in private rooms, had to be carried out daily by slaves. Spills were inevitable. In summer, the stench rose and spread through courtyards like a fog. Imagine Cleopatra walking through her own palace gardens, perfumed and painted, yet catching on the breeze not the fragrance of lotus, but the soreness of waste. Even the waters that cooled her palace were double-edged. Pools and fountains sparkled in the courtyards, reflecting the sky, lined with marble. But stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. The palace gardens, filled with ornamental ponds, must have buzzed in the evenings with biting insects. Servants lit incense to drive them off, but only partly succeeded. Malaria, spread by those mosquitoes, was a constant threat. To dine with Cleopatra by her lotus pond was to risk being bitten even as music played and dancers moved across the polished stone. And then there were the animals. Cats prowled freely, sacred and practical as vermin hunters. Dogs patrolled the grounds. Exotic birds were caged for show. But animals mean mess. Droppings in the corridors, feathers in the air, fur on the linens. The sacred ibis that strutted in the courtyards also left its mark. White splatters drying on the stone. Cleopatra loved the spectacle of animals, but their presence was another reminder that a palace is not a temple. It is a living, breathing, and therefore dirty space. The servants themselves, the army that sustained Cleopatra's image, brought their own burdens. Hundreds lived within the palace walls: cooks, maids, musicians, scribes, guards. They sweated, bled, coughed, relieved themselves. They slept in cramped quarters, sometimes on mats crowded together. Lice spread easily, fleas hopped from skin to skin, coughs echoed in the night. Disease brewed in those shadows. Even if Cleopatra herself reclined on clean linens, the breath of her palace was thick with contagion. What is striking, then, is how successfully Cleopatra concealed this reality. Guests did not leave her palace speaking of the rats or the sewage. They left speaking of her perfume, her voice, her radiance. How? Because the illusion was stronger than the reality. Incense burned constantly in bronze censers, flooding halls with the smell of resin. Musicians drowned the hum of flies with song. Lamps were polished until their gleam hid stains in the corners. Servants swept and fanned with endless labor. And above all, Cleopatra herself was a spectacle so powerful that she made her surroundings vanish. Who would notice a rat darting along the base of a wall when Cleopatra herself entered the room, eyes painted with divine fire, lips gleaming red, voice sweet as honey? The palace was a mirror of the queen, magnificent, intoxicating, and foul beneath the surface. Just as her cosmetics concealed sores, just as her perfumes smothered the smell of sweat, so too her palace concealed rot with gold. It is tempting to imagine that in private, Cleopatra was blind to it all, that she saw only the beauty. But she was not naive. She knew the price of her power. She walked the halls and smelled the sewage. She saw the flies, she heard the rats scuttling in the dark. But she understood better than anyone that perception is stronger than truth. Her task was not to cleanse the palace of its filth, but to ensure no one dared notice it. When Rome remembers Cleopatra, it remembers the grandeur, the feasts, the perfume, the silks, the queen who enslaved two of Rome's greatest men. It does not remember the cracked lips painted red with beetle dye, the rancid oil smeared as perfume, the rats feasting in her halls. And yet both are true. She was both goddess and mortal, both splendor and stench. That is the final paradox of Cleopatra's world. Beauty was not about cleanliness, nor about truth. It was about mastery of illusion. She took the dirty, the foul, the unhygienic, and turned it into a vision so powerful that it still dazzles us today. Her palace stank, her cosmetics poisoned, her perfumes rotted, and still, she conquered Caesar, Antony, and history itself. Cleopatra's secret, then, is not that she was clean, nor that she was pure. Her secret is that none of that mattered. All that mattered was that when she entered the room, the illusion was complete. And for 2,000 years, the world has believed it.